Most people believe America's fight for freedom began under King George III, but the truth is, this story began long before him, a forgotten king who shaped the colonies, controlled their trade, and set the stage for the revolution. This was King George II, and his rule over America is a dark chapter that history rarely talks about. George II became King of Britain in 1727. He was not born to be loved. He was born to rule, unlike his father George I, who barely spoke English and cared little for Britain. George II was active in politics. Wars and empire building. He spent much of his reign fighting battles in Europe, but across the ocean, his power stretched to the 13 colonies of America. To him, America was not a partner. It was property. The colonies were valuable pieces of land, meant to send wealth, crops, and resources back to London. Every ship that sailed, every coin minted, every trade made in America ultimately belonged to the crown. George II saw the colonies not as equals, but as assets during his rule. The American colonies grew rapidly, cities expanded, harbors were full of ships, farms produced endless crops, and plantations made Britain rich. At first glance, it looked like prosperity, but beneath the surface lay chains of control. The colonies could not trade freely. They were forced to sell their raw goods to Britain at low prices, and buy finished products back at high prices. It was a system designed to keep Britain powerful, and America-dependent merchants complained. Farmers struggled, and local assemblies had little power. Every law required approval from London, and the king's word was final. But the true cost of this prosperity was measured in human lives. Native Americans were driven off their ancestral lands, their villages burned, their treaties broken again and again. Entire nations of indigenous people were pushed aside, so colonists could claim land for Britain. African slaves were imported in greater numbers than ever before. Men, women, and children were sold like property, forced to work in brutal conditions on plantations in Virginia, the Carolinas, and beyond. Their suffering built the wealth of empire, while they lived and died in chains. And even poor European settlers, those who came seeking a better life, often found themselves trapped in endless debt to British merchants and landlords in America. Freedom was promised to many, but delivered to few. By the mid-1700s, resentment began to grow. The colonies were no longer fragile settlements. They were thriving societies with their own identity. Towns, schools, churches, and farms stretched across the coast, yet they were still treated as subjects, not citizens. The phrase that would one day ignite a revolution was already being whispered. No taxation without representation. George II never heard those words directly, but his policies planted the seeds. Colonists began to question why laws were made thousands of miles away, by men who never set foot in America, why their voices were silenced, while their labor built an empire. George II's reign was also marked by constant wars with France and Spain. The colonies became battlegrounds for European rivalries. British soldiers marched on American soil, demanding loyalty and resources for wars. The colonists never asked for. Taxes were raised, supplies were seized, and young men were sent to fight in conflicts that served the crown, not the colonies. The presence of redcoats in American towns reminded everyone of one fact: they were subjects of empire, not free people. George II died in 1760, passing the throne to his grandson George III. History remembers George III as the villain of the American Revolution. But the truth is that much of the anger, the frustration, and the chains of control were already in place long before him. George II ruled for 33 years. 33 years of taxes, restrictions, broken treaties, and injustice. By the time he was gone, the colonies were already restless, already bitter, and already dreaming of a future without a king. So while history books celebrate George III as the tyrant of the revolution, we cannot ignore the forgotten king who set the stage. King George II's rule over America is a reminder that empires do not collapse in a single moment. They crumble slowly under the weight of greed and control. This was the forgotten rule of King George II in America. If you found this story powerful, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Dark Past TV, and hit the bell icon, because more untold stories of empires, wars, and the dark side of history